Okay, Algebra 2, this is the quadratic formula, which is 4.6. So 4.6, quadratic formula. Guys, the quadratic formula is, as states here, x equals the opposite of b. Notice I'm not saying negative b because I don't want you to think that it always has to be negative. It's the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, if we had more time and were to develop this, we could use completing the square to find this, and but we're not going to today. We'll do that next time. So, I've got a couple steps here for using the quadratic formula. Number one, I want to always put things into standard form. Make sure you're in y equals ax squared plus bx plus c so that you can easily find, in step 3, a, b, and c. So step 2, it's a formula. Always write it down. Write it down, write it down, write it down. So you write it down in step 2, you find a, b, and c in your ax squared plus bx plus c. Find a, b, and c, because then all you have to do is fill it in. Play coach. Plug it in, evaluate. Use order of operations, and you are golden. Now, there are three different ways to use, or not different ways, three different results from using the quadratic formula. I'll take you through a couple examples. The first example, guys, there are two solutions. And so I am going to walk you through this. So minus 16 because I have to get to standard form. So ax squared plus 6x minus 16 equals 0. Now, it has to be set equal to 0. Your quadratic, you're technically solving for what x is, make it the y value equals 0. And so, we now can say that a is 1, because it's the coefficient, b is 6, and c is negative 16. I have to write down the formula, negative or opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And now I can start to fill that in. Opposite of 6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4. I am using parentheses, I think everybody can see, where my numbers will be. So a is 1 and c was a negative 16 and a was 1 again. And now it just becomes down to, let's evaluate this. Opposite of 6 is negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared is 36. Negative here makes a positive, so I'm going to change those. And 4 times 16. 4 times 2 is 32. Times that by another 2 is 64. So plus 64. All of that will be over 2 equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 100 over 2. And now you just have to evaluate. Make sure you understand that, hey, everybody should know what square root of 100 is. And so x equals opposite of 6 plus or minus 10 all over 2. Now, 6, 10, and 2, or negative 6, 10, and 2 are nice numbers. So I will expect you to actually separate these and evaluate them for their value. So negative 6 plus 10 over 2 and negative 6 minus 10 over 2. Those are things that you should be able to do because there are two answers, a plus and a minus. So you evaluate them both, you get 4 over 2, which ends up being 2, and negative 16 over 2, or negative 8. And so we found two answers to be 2 and negative 8. What does it mean? It means that if I plug those answers back up into here, x squared plus 6x will equal 16, or x squared plus 6x minus 16 will equal 0 when I plug in the negative 8 and the 2. So there are two answers. This one, there's only going to be one solution. And so I got to write down that formula because it's already in standard form. Make sure your square root goes over the whole thing. So x equals a negative of, of negative 16 plus or minus the square root of negative 16 squared minus 4 times 1 times 64 this time, all over 2 times 1. So it looks like it's going to be daunting, but it's not going to be too bad. You take it one step at a time. So that's 16 plus or minus the square root of 16 squared, I'm hoping negative 16 squared, but if you square a negative, it becomes positive, is 256, minus 4 times 64 is 256. Ooh, interesting. So if you think about it, these will disappear. They'll be gone. And it goes to 0. So I'll get 16 plus or minus the square root of 0 all over 2. But what's the square root of 0? The square root of 0 is 0. So you get 16 over 2 because a plus or minus nothing doesn't do anything, and you get one answer of 8. So that's what's going to happen. So you get one solution when this inside piece goes to 0. You get two solutions when it wasn't 0. Now let's take a look when it says there's no real solution, but there's two imaginary solutions. So it's already in standard form, so opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Again, I write it down every time. It's going to help you guys immensely. So negative of 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times 1 all over 2 times 3. I feel like I might have wrote this down wrong because this does not come out. Let me take a look at this one. Yes, I made a mistake of writing this down. This should not be plus 1, it should be plus 4. So therefore, it ends up being a 4 inside. Now I can see that this is going to go well. Everything still stays the same except for that 4. And now I get x equals negative of 5 plus or minus the square root. 5 squared is 25 minus 4 times 3 is 12. Times that by 4. 4 times 12 is what, 48? All over 6. Now, 25 minus 48 actually does not turn out to be positive. So I get negative 5 plus or minus the square root of a negative. And so you end up with negative 23 inside all over 6. Now going back to the lesson before, we don't like negative square roots, so I got to poke an eye out. So negative 5 plus or minus square root of 23i all over 6. Now, 23 is a prime number. You can't break it down anymore, so there's no partners, and so I can leave it. And I also am going to leave it as this is with a plus or a minus, is because this is not good. This is not nice. This is an irrational number. And so therefore, it's going to come out to decimals if I try to separate it. So why separate it? Just keep it as negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 23i plus 6. Or all divided by 6, sorry. So keep it that way. Now, what was I talking about that, hey, there's two solutions, one solution, two imaginary solutions? Well, guys, we can do this really quickly just by looking at that part that was inside the square root. That was called the discriminant. So b squared minus 4ac. In the very first problem, we came up with a positive discriminant. Therefore, there was two solutions. In the second problem, I pointed out that the discriminant inside the square root was 0. So therefore, there's only one solution because you're not adding or subtracting anything. And then the very last problem, it actually ended up being a negative, I think a negative 23, which meant there was no real solutions. That's because it brings the I into it. It's two imaginary solutions. So in the last part of your homework, you're just going to have to find the discriminant, b squared minus 4ac, and then tell me what type and how many solutions are there. So for our example here, all I need to know is what does this come out to? For b squared minus 4ac, and then tell me, is it 2 positive, 1 positive or 2 imaginary. And so a, b, and c are still the same. Put it in standard form. Evaluate this. So it'd be 8 squared minus 4 times negative 5 times negative 1. So 64. 2 negatives make a positive, but there is still one more negative there. And that's 4 times 5, which is 20, times 1. So therefore, it would be minus 20, which will equal 44. 44 is positive. So therefore, there's my discriminant, it's 44, and there's 2 real solutions. And that is your lesson. Here's your homework. I erased all the things that you do not need to do. So it looks like 6, 7, 8, 9 problems. Make sure you use the quadratic formula. Write it down every time. Have a great day.